Hirschfield is the inaugural Lily and Tara Horner Chair in Autoimmune Liver Disease Research at the Toronto Centre for Liver Disease, Toronto General Hospital, and Professor of Medicine in the Division of Gastroenterology at the University of Toronto. Dr. Hirschfield is leading the Autoimmune Liver Disease Program at TCLD with his colleague, Dr. Aliya Ghulam Hussain. Dr. Hirschfield is the recipient of many international awards and is a global key opinion leader in autoimmune liver disease. He's published over 200 papers, among which include publications as lead author in high-impact scientific journals, New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, and Nature Genetics. And he's also super generous with his time, and we thank you very much for giving us part of your Sunday. Please welcome Dr. Hirschfield.
Thank you. Is there let's move the slides forward. That's just you, okay. Jimmy is my slide mover. So look, my name's Gideon. I'm a clinician. I work at Toronto General. I've worked as a clinician for nearly 25 years now, I guess. And I really think, you know, Mary, this meeting's nothing about me. This meeting's because people like Mary and all the other people who work hard for PSC patients and the patients here today and their family are interested to learn more. And what we're hoping, you know, what I'd like to believe that doctors and nurses and pharmacists and scientists are doing more is breaking down the barrier between patients and their teams. And any of you who follow us on Twitter will know that on Friday, one of my colleagues, Hemant Shah, we had a fantastic, we have a once-a-year training day for everybody on liver disease, and we had some patients talking, but we also had a surprise patient. We had one of our colleagues presented a very, very complex patient where we had the chance to talk about what we would do, and different people had different opinions, and then our colleague Dave Wong actually brought the patient into the room, and the first thing he said to wake us all up, he says, "I'm alive." Okay? Because it was actually a very complicated story. So really, what I've done today is to come here and to talk about the disease. I don't expect you to go through the detail of every slide. The slides are there to remind me what the topics we should talk about. The second thing is that feel free to interrupt. You know, this is very informal. You know, there isn't a question that is stupid, because actually we ask ourselves questions all the time on a daily basis, and we see things and we think, I still don't understand how or why, okay? And then again, because I think we should be breaking down the barriers, because knowledge is no longer hidden away in the Encyclopedia Britannica. You don't have to wait for that guy to come knocking on the door to sell you your subscription to the Encyclopedia Britannica. You know, I'm using the same slides that I use for any talk that I give anywhere in the world, okay? Because that's the best way to show that actually I'm not hiding anything from you, whether it's easy or whether it's hard. Next slide. So there probably aren't that many Brits in the room, but as you might have noticed, I'm British. And one of the things that we're really good at in Britain is roundabouts. Okay. Now, I have driven around some of Ontario, and I discovered there are a few places with some roundabouts. I think it was going towards Brighton, Ontario, but this is, anyone who's driven around London, that's the Hanger Lane Gyratory, okay, which is a very complicated roundabout. But I thought about it and how I could use that to explain PSC. So I want to explain the bottom part of the slide first, and then I'll explain the top part, okay, because it's a difficult disease. Okay, it's a disease that is of your bile ducts and a disease of your bowels. Not everyone's got bowel disease, but you know, to a large proportion of patients have got one disease of their colon and their bile ducts. And we're just in the process with Tom Carlson of writing a little picture journey of PSC. We're about 6 months late on submitting it, but it's going to be a picture journey for a global audience through the Journal of Hepatology, and we're going to try and focus around what I call the 4 C's. Okay, the 4 C's that worry our patients, that worry their clinicians living with PSC. So cholangitis, that's inflammation of the bile ducts. Colitis, that's the inflammation of their colon. Cancer, because I cannot tell you that cancer doesn't worry you and it doesn't worry us. And the consequence of inflammation, which is cirrhosis. Okay, and that's what I'm going to try and capture as to how we diagnose this disease, how we make prognosis, how we tell you what's going to happen, and at the end, what we're trying to do to change that course. And then I'm going to give you a quote, okay? And this quote comes from Kid Rock. Now, he is apparently a singer, okay? And it comes from let's rock on, okay? And you always learn something from your patients. And this was the quote from a very dear patient of mine: if it looks good, you'll see it. If it sounds right, you'll feel it. If it's marketed right, you'll buy it. But if it's real, you'll feel it. And let's rock on. Now, it's true, this came from his obituary, okay? But I learnt from him, and I learnt, therefore, about the disease from looking after him and from how he tackled the disease, which for him was very impactful and for his family was deeply impactful. But I'd strongly recommend that you think about that quote and also think about the quote that you want for yourselves, because you can't stand down and let something that you have no control over determine who you are. You have to be who you are, and the disease is something that comes with you. Next slide. So this is the picture of the liver, and the honest truth is the only exam I nearly failed, I've never actually failed an exam, but the only exam I nearly failed was my first year anatomy when I was at university. Because I'm not as good as our surgeons, and surgeons see the world in 3D. Okay, they can really see things, and that's why you're going to see some really live things, because that's how they think, that's what their job is. Okay, but it's important to think about your liver on the right side, your spleen on the left, and how your bile ducts are part of your liver. They're one and the same. They're different cell origin, but liver cells, bile ducts, left hepatic duct, right hepatic duct, coming down to the common duct, your gallbladder, which is your gallbladder, which stores bile, and then emptying into the bowel, and how it's also close to the pancreas, which is why some of our patients sometimes do get pancreas inflammation and pain, because it's all so closely linked. Next slide. And your liver is, we like to think, cleverer than the kidney, probably not as important as your heart, but it makes lots of things. It makes proteins, clotting proteins, carrier proteins, your immunology. When you have liver disease, you can be as immunosuppressed as somebody having chemotherapy. When you're at the very last stages of liver disease, you've got cirrhosis and you're starting to get sick from your liver, you're immunosuppressed because your liver doesn't make the right proteins. It detoxifies chemicals, and this is probably one of the reasons we see liver disease, because it really takes in all the chemicals that are around us. I'm reviewing a paper submitted by some of my colleagues about why people get another liver disease called PBC, and they're speculating, could it be due to cadmium? And could that be due to coal mining? Now I don't know that they're right or wrong, but the principles there, that around us are lots of environmental toxins, and they've got to go somewhere. And then they get expressed, and that expression then can lead to disease. And then it produces bile. And bile actually is more than just about absorption. You can't function without bile, because bile is actually a signaling molecule. It contains signaling molecules, bile acids, that link the bowel, the liver, and then we'll talk about it, and no doubt will come up in questions, the microbiome. All these bugs that live within you. Now, again, I read a really amazing paper yesterday, I just read the title really, about how when you eat red meat, the bacteria in your bowel can change to the bacteria that are better able to metabolize red meat. Okay? And that's actually the same. They've even done this in wild animals. They've shown that there are some animals that if you change the bugs, they can no longer eat the food that they find in the jungle because they can't digest it. So we are totally dependent on that relationship between our liver, our bowel, and the bugs that live within. Next slide. Symptoms are important. That's how you ultimately get diagnosed usually, or sometimes it's because you had blood tests done. But many patients have no symptoms. Other patients have symptoms they can't explain, or sometimes you have symptoms that really make sense. Pain, itch, and the consequences of bile duct blockage, which is not a symptom, but it's a sign, jaundice. Next slide. So why this is important is because it speaks to when we make a diagnosis for our patients, we use that information to give you the diagnosis and also what's going to happen to you. Because you want to understand your trajectory. You're on a journey, you're on an escalator, you can see, any of those who are in Pearson Airport who see me there every week, you'll know that Pearson Airport, when you land, there's that slow, whatever you call it, walk escalator, and there's that really, really fast one where you sort of have to try and keep up with it, okay? And what you're trying to understand as a patient is at what speed am I currently going, okay, so that I know what I need to do and what I need to plan for or not need to plan for because I'm planning to do other things. So it all goes back to how we diagnose our patients. We take a history. We saw a guy actually a couple of weeks ago where, I won't tell you the diagnosis, but he brought the diagnosis in his story and in the neat photocopies of all the tests he's had done for the last 25 years where he's been around the world. And none of his previous doctors had listened to the story or read the pieces of paper that he brought with, and therefore had got the diagnosis completely wrong. So 9 times out of 10 you make the diagnosis in the story, but then we examine you, we look at your blood tests, we take pictures of you, we look without touching, and sometimes we look under the microscope. Next slide. But, we have to use our tests sensibly, okay? And it's true that we don't choose as wisely as we should as doctors because we're very, very cautious people, and we often over-test, okay? Again, and that's one of the challenges that we have. We rely too much on tests, not so much on what's obvious is obvious, what's common is common, okay? And what's in the history tells you the answer. So, we've always got to think that through. And that's something I think you guys need to learn about, because certainly for those patients who come to UHN, I think those patients who go to Sunnybrook and most other hospitals in the province, you now have literally live access to your results. And I think that's fantastic, but I'll also caution you have live access to every result, okay? And some of those results are pretty complicated, and some of those results even we take time to digest and think about what they mean. And our patients get them before we've even seen them, okay? So you need to think very carefully when you're reading a thing that it's still part of this matrix of who you are. It isn't black and white. Nothing is black and white. Next slide. So we rely a lot on liver enzymes, and liver enzymes are not really actually about your liver disease. They're about how your liver works in health. They're about how it handles and detoxifies and makes proteins. But when a liver cell is swollen or inflamed, it leaks. Proteins leak out, enzymes leak out. And so we can measure those, and because of where we know they are made, we know that, for example, when we see an elevated alkaline phosphatase, or in children an elevated gamma GT, that's likely to come from bile duct inflammation. That's likely, therefore, to relate to diseases of the bile ducts, which include primary sclerosing cholangitis. But these are not specific to one disease, and on the other side of the liver cell, we can see enzymes like ALT and AST that can be leach out as well, okay? And they're usually what we call about when we see a hepatitis, and usually when we see an elevated alkaline phosphatase and gamma GT, we're thinking about bile duct inflammation. But it's not perfect. Patients with PSC very frequently have very high levels of ALT and AST because bile acids are detergents, and if you put a detergent on a set of liver cells, they'll get sore, and the enzymes will leak out. That doesn't mean that because other people have diseases such as autoimmune hepatitis where they have a high ALT, that you've got autoimmune hepatitis. It simply means that those enzymes can be elevated but not specific. Next slide. We sometimes look for antibodies. This is less relevant for patients with PSC, except when we trap ourselves by too much knowledge and we start to suggest that they've got an overlap with another disease like autoimmune hepatitis. And this causes an awful lot of confusion because we're not that clever, and none of the tests that I'm showing you are specific to one disease. So if we test anybody, with 100 tests, then statistics tells us that 5% of those tests will be abnormal, because that is the definition of a normal distribution if we're only looking at, say, the bottom end of a test range. Next slide. And then we do fancy tests in PSC, and we'll talk about the MRI in a second, but actually we do simple tests like ultrasound, which are very good. We like to look at what your liver looks like. We like to see how big your spleen is. We like to see whether the liver is rough. Okay, simple, safe, not dangerous. Apart from the jelly, there really is nothing to an ultrasound, but it's important. Next slide. The MRI is also important, but it's not perfect. So you do an MRI in PSC because you want to see the bile ducts in great detail. You want to see whether they're smooth. You want to see whether they're narrowed and whether they're inflamed or whether there's scarring. And you want to see where that scarring is and whether it's in one place or in lots of places. And more importantly, you're interested to know, has it changed over time? But it's not a perfect test. It's not a perfect test because it's actually very difficult. It's difficult to interpret. And it actually, if we go back to you guys, it's actually quite difficult to lie still. I did actually do an MRI a couple of times for one of the research projects one of my fellows was doing. You know, and it's true, you do worry that they're not going to come back. Okay? You're lying in that room, you're told to hold your breath, and you're thinking, have they gone for tea? Are they actually going to come back? You know.
And you're itchy.
And you're itchy, and if you move your head, you're going to bang your head, aren't you? You know, and so there's a huge amount of trust involved, you know, compared to having an ultrasound when you have an MRI scan, because, you know, they make sure they're nice and safe outside so no magnetic things can hit the magnet, and you're stuck there trying to wonder whether or not did they say breathe in or did they say breathe out? Okay? So not perfect. And again, no test is perfect, and we use all of those tests to understand your journey and to understand at the speed that you're going. Okay? Some of our patients will have a speed that is nice and slow. Some of our patients will have a moderate speed. Some of our patients will have a speed that we're not happy with. They're sliding too fast to needing a new liver. Okay? At the end of the day, that's the disease. You know, Sonia's going to understand the science and prevent that in the future. But for the now, we have to tell you what speed you're driving. Okay? And last week I was in Frankfurt, and you'll know that they don't have a speed limit on their motorways. Okay? You know, this guy was driving like 150 kilometers, and you never know whether to tell your taxi driver to slow down, because they really take that as an offense, don't they? Because it's like, well, I'm a safe driver. And you're thinking, not at that speed, you're not. Okay? So at the end of the day, you've got to know what speed you're going, but you've got to know how to interpret it. The challenge also with PSC is your speed can change. And we can see people speed up a little bit, then actually get better again. Okay? And that adds to the sort of the difficulty in timing everything. Next slide. And then sometimes we've got to do a full MOT. Okay, we've got to look properly at your car, and that means you've got to have a liver biopsy. We don't do liver biopsies that often. I have to say I hardly do liver biopsies in PSC patients. About the only time I do it is for clinical trials. Okay, but it does have a role, and you know we want to avoid it, but it is a tiny piece. But it's representative of some of the inflammation and damage that we see. Next slide. So when you look down the liver is very, very, very clever. Okay? And what happens is that, you know, your blood comes into the peripheries of what essentially is like a hexagon, and then it percolates to the middle, to the central vein, and then it leaves the liver. So the liver sits there, taking blood from your bowel, and stopping you from having essentially what the liver does for immunological purposes is that if you didn't have a liver, every time you ate, you would collapse. Okay? Because after you eat, you're bound to get bacterial contamination and bacterial products, because that's what happens from your bowel. And the liver takes all of the nutrients, plus some of the things that are, you know, released from bugs, and it stops them from being circulated around the liver. It basically sorts out the different proteins going different places and the fats and everything. So it has the system of coming in around the periphery and then drifting all through to go out and leaving in the central vein. Next slide. And then at greater detail where the business is, okay, and only Sonia will know that this is actually a mouse liver, not a human liver, okay? But it's a really pretty picture. You see a small bile duct, and always next to a bile duct, you always see an artery, okay? And unusually, and it is unusual, but it's relevant, the bile ducts get their blood supply from the arterial blood supply to the liver, not from the veins. Okay? That's important because when your blood supply to your arteries is damaged, that means you damage your bile ducts. Okay? And then you've got the portal vein, which is again all this blood coming in from the bowel. Next slide. On top of that, the difference with PSC is the disease is focused around your bile ducts. Okay? And this is the classic picture that we think of when we think of a patient with PSC. We don't see it very often. We really usually only see it if we take out the whole liver of a patient at transplant. Okay? But you see what's known as concentric fibrosis. You've got onion skin fibrosis around the bile duct. And what's paradoxical for this disease really that we're talking about, you don't see much inflammation, you just see the scar tissue. Okay? Yet you know there's inflammation. If I were to show you what your bile ducts look like from the inside, they look red and hot and very, very sore. Okay? They look very inflamed. But when we take the liver out, what we see is scar tissue. Okay? And that scar tissue around the bile duct is extinguishing that bile duct, making it impossible for the bile to get out, causing narrowings. But it's patchy. It's not the same in all of your bile ducts. Next slide. And this is what we're trying to prevent. But this journey from normal to very, very scarred and knobbly liver, cirrhosis, and the liver is phenomenally forgiving. It continues to look after you, it continues to protect you, it continues to hang on. And actually sometimes for our patients, nearer when they need to get to the liver transplant, sometimes at that point they get a little bit peeved with the liver, because actually the liver doesn't give up, okay? And in the 21st century, what that means is it sometimes makes it harder to get the transplant that you need, because the liver keeps hanging in there, and your tests are sort of stuck, and you're not sick enough, okay? Yet you know you're clearly not well enough. And that's a good thing, I guess, overall. It's just a frustration, but it's helpful to understand. Next slide. Varices then arise because the blood can't percolate through the liver. It's a closed system. The blood has to get back, and it needs to keep circulating. And these veins were there in embryonic terms. They're not supposed to be used, but the body's quite clever. When the pressure rises and the blood has to get back to the heart, it finds other routes home. The problem with this is these veins are thinner walled, and even under low pressure, the pressure is not actually very high, but even under low pressure, they may bleed. Next slide. And then comes the perplexing thing. Here is the most complex of the liver diseases that we look after. Much more complicated than other liver diseases because we don't know the cause. It's not like viral hepatitis where we cure patients at the moment, but that's where we want to get to. But because it's two diseases, it's that fibroinflammation around the bile ducts, and for the large part, it's inflammation in the colon. So something, probably something in your bowel, something around the bacteria, is leading to inflammation in what we call the mucosa of the colon, mucosa of the bile ducts. Next slide. But even still, this inflammation is different to the inflammation of your patient's colleagues that you meet at the IBD clinic. They have classical ulcerative colitis. Their disease behaves in one way. When it's this disease associating the bowel and the liver together, we see the inflammation is often milder, it's often on the right side, and there is, yes, a higher rate of colon cancer, which is why you win yourself an annual colonoscopy. Okay, it's a bit like ERCP, a bit like anything. Once you've had your first, the second to the 33rd is not so bad. Okay, it's always the first that is the worst. Okay, and then you get used to it. And just to be blunt, you know, what most patients tell us, the prep is a hell of a lot worse than the actual procedure itself. Okay, most people don't know that until they've had the first. Okay, next slide. Now, it is time to move forward. Okay, and that's really hard. Okay, because we only have one therapy at present, ursodeoxycholic acid, and we all have very emotional associations about whether it works. Some of those emotions might be professional, so I'm clearly of the belief it doesn't work, whereas some of my colleagues, like Ulrich Boyers, were the first people in the world to do the clinical trials in PBC and in PSC, so his whole career has been around the use of ursodeoxycholic acid. So he clearly believes it does work, but you know, he also acknowledges it doesn't work well enough. But you know, at some point we've got to move beyond that. We have to try and help you get treatments that really change. And I, don't want to use Boris as an exemplar. He has strengths and he has weaknesses. But we do need to try and move beyond the dithering and the delay and the confusion. Okay? And the only way we're going to do this is in partnership with our patients and trying to step forward. And what that means is that the steps we take are going to be small steps. But each step will jump a hurdle, we'll understand something a bit better, we'll learn something even if it's not a success. And hopefully, just like as you watch your kids start to walk, they'll start off and they'll fall over a lot, but ultimately they will run the 100 meters in 10 seconds. Okay? That's what you hope for. Okay? And then we're only going to get there by taking small steps. It is going to be hard. Next slide. And so this is a hard slide, but I wanted to show it to you because I said, this isn't about keeping knowledge from you, okay? This is about understanding how we tell the world, and you see you have a sponsor for today. That sponsor is backed by venture capital. Someone has to believe in it, that they want to, invest to have a go to make a difference. Sonia gets a grant because she says this is important. If she doesn't tell them why it's important, they'll give the grant to somebody else. So this is what happens with 100 people. This is using all of the data from the NHS in England. We've just started the journey to try and get it published. And we're looking at what happens to people. And I want to remind you that we all die, okay? So that is an inevitability. We're all on the same journey in that one. We're on the same boat, okay? But if you just have ulcerative colitis, okay, then your disease is a lot more benign than if you develop PSC. Okay, so in the world, 1% of the population have got ulcerative colitis or inflammatory bowel disease. Now it's a very common disease. You know, over 10 years, the event rate, about 1 in 10 will have a colectomy, and about 2 out of 100 will get cancer. Now, if you then look at what happens to our patients with PSC and why we're so determined to make a change and why we're so pleased to have patients on our side, is that when we look at what happens to someone with PSC, it's a lot more difficult, it's a lot more ominous, it's a lot more important, okay? And if you just look at the bottom half, if we time it from the time that our patients get diagnosed with PSC, and we watch everything that happens to them over 10 years, and this is all of our patients, and so, you know, we'll show you why this is a nuanced story, okay? You can see that, you know, there's a large number of patients, 30 patients out of 100 over 10 years will have had a significant event, a transplant or a mortality. 20 out of 100 will have had a colectomy, and 10 out of 100 will have had colon cancer. Now that's everyone together, and we'll come on to how you individually risk stratify. That isn't you as an individual, that's the population. But we can only work on population data when we take the entire data set of our healthcare. Next slide. Because then what we did was, we want everyone to live as long as possible. We want to put the right people into clinical trials, and we want those clinical trials to be a success, because success begets success. So you can lose good drugs because the trial was designed badly, and the drug actually may have been helpful, but the trial was designed incorrectly and you put the wrong people in it, and someone says, oh, it doesn't look very good, I'll put my investment in something else, okay? So we looked at by age, okay? And this is self-fulfilling, but it's important. The greatest impact is for our younger patients, those patients under the age of 50 when they're diagnosed with PSC. That doesn't mean it's not impactful for our patients over the age of 50, but as you'd expect, once you're over the age of 60, you are more likely to die of something else than to die of your PSC. Now this is important because, again, when we're trying to prove a new therapy makes people live longer, we've got to use the right data, we've got to get the right patients. And that's why we're very keen to make sure our patients understand the impact and what they can do in terms of taking part in trials, because actually, if PSC has a journey of 25 years for lots of patients, that means there's a long time where you feel individually that you don't gain anything from being in a clinical trial. Okay. However, actually, that might be the time when you have the greatest chance to make a difference. Okay. Whereas the last few years may be the time that you have no chance to make a difference because things are so far down the stream. So it is a complex one for us to explain to our patients, but we're using this to understand how to give you the right knowledge in clinic about what's going to happen to you. Next slide. So, we all want to use our blood test to tell us what's going to happen. And alkaline phosphatase is not a bad test at that, okay? Broadly speaking, the lower your alkaline phosphatase, the better you do, okay? Not perfect, and we don't actually know what the cutoff is, and it may be that the cutoff is actually lower than we think. So even in alkaline phosphatase, let's say the normal range for alkaline phosphatase is 120, some people would suggest that the cutoff for being in the group that has the higher risk of events is 150 to 160. And that's actually a relatively low alkaline phosphatase. But this original paper looked at an alkaline phosphatase of, say, around 175, and you can see the people with persistently good ALK phos did better than the people with high ALK phos. So we use that information to understand who might benefit the most from a new treatment now. Next slide. And this is just to show you, again, don't worry about the details, that we can take the same information. This was 1,000 patients from across the UK with PSC where we had their alkaline phosphatase at the beginning and 2 years afterwards, and it works, okay? It helps us understand which group is of you or where you are. And that's because it's self-fulfilling. Alkaline phosphatase is elevated because of bile duct inflammation, and so the higher your bile duct inflammation, there is more likely to be progressive damage. Next slide. But here's the challenge, and this is why we have to move beyond URSO. You can drop your alkaline phosphatase with a drug like ursodeoxycholic acid. The study clearly showed it really didn't matter whether the drug dropped your alkaline phosphatase or you were the person who had a low alkaline phosphatase because your disease is milder, the outcome was the same. So it wasn't URSO, so that link between a high alkaline phosphatase causing prognosis is not the same as saying that if you drop your alkaline phosphatase that necessarily the drug is going to make you live longer. Now, that doesn't mean that isn't what we want from a drug. It just means we have to think it through very, very carefully. And that's because there's a whole set of different things that cause alkaline phosphatase to drop, and also because if you take someone who's got mild disease, whatever you give them is going to look really good. Okay? Someone with mild disease may have a history, a lifetime history of PSC of 30 years. Okay? So whatever you do, that drug is going to look wonderful. Okay? Because you started with mild disease and anything's going to look good. We actually want to treat the patients with moderate to advanced disease, and that's why it's harder. Next slide. The other thing is it varies a lot. So we can use it to help you get some idea of your trajectory. But this is what happened when we measured alkaline phosphatase. There were over 250 patients from around the world who took part in a clinical trial for Gilead. That trial, that drug did not work. But what they've learned from that trial to help the next trial has been phenomenal. Okay? Because we've analysed the data repeatedly, we've learned about PSC, not about the drug, but we've learned about the disease. The challenge is that alkaline phosphatase fluctuates. It does this all the time. So if you're going to use it to say that your drug makes someone better, you have to show that your drug is more than the fluctuation. Okay? So it's like showing that your effect is stronger than the wind. Okay? Next slide. And for all of us, and again, don't worry about the details, okay? It varies. We all have a variation, and it varies more when you've got PSC. Okay? And it can vary by 10, 30, 40%. And we now have to show, and this is frustrating for our patients, that when we do a clinical trial, and we're going to use the alkaline phosphatase to get you into that clinical trial, you may be asked to have your blood test done twice, sometimes 3 times. And you may not be allowed into the trial if it's doing this. Because they'll say, you're not the patient we want in the trial at the moment, because if you're doing this, how am I going to work out what my drug did to you? Okay? Because this is your oscillation is already at a high speed. We'll never learn something. Now, that's disappointing for you, but actually overall more people benefit because we learn more from that trial because it was strict in who the patients they took and the noise was less. So we have a greater chance of getting the most knowledge from that study. So again, that's the balance between you as an individual and you as a community. Next slide. Lots of things we looked at to see, and essentially not much associates with that variability. So actually, it varies when we don't really understand all the reasons why. Next slide. And the next thing is, using this data set, your baseline alkaline phosphatase does predict how you'll do, but the change in alkaline phosphatase did not. So when the alkaline phosphatase dropped, that did not correlate with either good or bad. Okay? And that goes back to the Urso story, and we can touch upon it, the Vancomycin story. How do we know that a drug that drops your alkaline phosphatase is actually helping you and making a difference? And that's the challenge. So we have to use other things. Next slide. That's where liver biopsy comes in. Okay? And liver biopsy is not what anyone wants, but it's not a bad test of scarring. And ultimately, it's a test that the people who approve drugs understand. And we know that the more scarring that you have, the closer you are to an event. But what we learned from this trial, and this is all the patients in all 3 different arms of the trial, and looking at what happened to their liver biopsy over essentially 2 years. And this is the challenge, okay? 1/3 of patients, their biopsy got worse. 1/3 of patients, there was no change. And 1/3 of patients improved. And this isn't a drug that did nothing. Okay? So if you don't understand what's happening normally, what you're trying to do is something beyond normal, okay? You have to take into account when you do a study that this variation is going to happen. There will be some people who get worse, but some people actually got better because no test is perfect. Next slide. And what we tried to do in this analysis here is work out who to put into the clinical trial. And essentially what we learned, and this is again the reason why some patients won't get into clinical trials, it is better to take people with a little bit of fibrosis than to take people who've got no scarring. So if we take you too early in the journey, then nothing's going to happen to you over 2 years. Nothing will change. It is a slow disease. We could do a biopsy every day for 2 years. It will look the same. Okay? If we take people too far in the journey, then obviously we can't show progression. So we need to get them in the middle. Okay? They've got some scarring, but not too much. Next slide. And this is another way of showing that we're looking at who should we put into clinical trials and who has the events. And essentially it's based on that we need people who've gone beyond the very early stage, but not gone too far. Next slide. Now, it then comes, what do we as a community, and this includes you, would be sufficient evidence for a new drug? And we could set the bar at too high a level, and then it's nearly impossible, or we could set the bar at the next level down, and then all our patients would accept. It may not be perfect, but at least it's progress. And probably what you would like, and maybe where the world will leave, is that at least if you had in a clinical trial and you had a biopsy at day 1 and 2 years later, a successful drug would mean that you hadn't got worse. Okay? It would mean that people who didn't get the drug must get a little bit worse. Okay? And that is actually probably a better bar to aim for than a drug that makes you get better. Okay? Because that's really hard. So what we're probably going to aim for is drugs that in the placebo we see some progression, in the treated patients they don't get any worse. Okay? And that will be the starting point for a drug that we can then get on the market for patients with PSC. Next slide. Now, no one likes a biopsy, just like no one likes a colonoscopy. What about blood tests? Now, this is a blood test called ELF, which will eventually come to North America. It's been actually around, it's fascinating, it's all about the world of commerce. It's been around in Europe for at least 10 years. It's still not got a license in America, and it won't get a license in Canada until there's a license in America, because that's the way of the world. Okay, so that license will come in the next couple of years, because they're applying. And this is a blood test that you can have, which measures scarring, not perfect, and helps us predict where you're going to go. So that's better than a biopsy, and that's where the world is moving. We'll use a blood test, something like ELF, fibrosis turnover, and say you're in a group, the bottom group, that's going to do worse. That helps us. Next slide. Because what we found was, in this clinical trial, although the drug didn't work, if your ELF score got better, and essentially or didn't increase, that was a good thing. Okay? So now you could target drugs and say, how do I know if they're working? Okay, I'm looking for no progression. I maybe biopsy some of my patients, but overall, if the ELF test stays the same, whereas in the other group, the ELF test keeps going up, that's a drug that we can get to market. Why is this important? Because you want to get the drug to market as quickly as possible to try and benefit people. At the same time, you don't want a drug that doesn't work. So you've got to strike a balance. Next slide. And again, actually all the things that come up associate with how much scarring you got. Next slide. So, what about FibroScan? Now this is slowly becoming more available in Ontario. We're lucky at our centre to have a couple of scanners and to be able to offer it to you without paying. There is access to FibroScan in some other centres, and there are clinics now that have been set up because the government doesn't reimburse FibroScan directly, so you can basically buy your FibroScan from a clinic. It's non-invasive, it's not perfect, it basically measures your liver stiffness, okay? Liver stiffness does not equal liver fibrosis. It equals scarring, inflammation, and bile duct obstruction, okay? It measures 3 things, okay? However, the more stiff your liver, the more pressure it's under, the more likely that means that your liver is on a journey to needing to be changed. And what we're learning is that if we use this test, not because it's perfect, not because it doesn't have its own oscillation, but we can see your trajectory. So again, we're mapping where are you in your journey to help you plan how long that journey is, whether you're going to take a detour or whether you're going to keep driving. Okay, next slide. And essentially you can see that once your FibroScan is above a certain level, that you're going to run into problems. And in this study it was around about 18. I mean, that's just an example of a number, it doesn't mean it is the number. Okay? Or if your FibroScan is increasing year on year, that means that something's happening. Again, it's not really relevant that it isn't, it's a mixture of different things, but it's something's happening. Next slide. This is a study that will be presented at the Boston Liver Meeting in November. Olivier Chaslier runs a whole network really across France for rare liver disease. They're really well ahead of the rest of Europe and America because they're very networked care. And they've now got patients, and we contributed from the UK and other people have contributed around the world, showing that this number, the FibroScan, does associate with who is going to run into problems. Okay? And we have to therefore use this information to help us choose the right people for trials. And that might mean we say, your FibroScan is too good, you're too early, you can wait. Or your FibroScan is too high, you can't enter this trial because it's not appropriate for you at that time. That is frustrating, but it's all designed to make sure that every study we do gives us the best information, rather than have studies that at the end we say, we're still as unclear as we were at the beginning, but we're $25 million poorer. Okay, you have to design studies and try and make them a success. Next slide. Now this is a test I would like you to have more access to. It's not perfect. It has similar issues to FibroScan, but there's a lot of challenge in accessing its MRI. Okay, it's MRI measuring scarring rather than FibroScan measuring scarring. We can't do this down at UHM, but the reality is, and I'll tell you, this is a very good test. It helps you, again, not perfect, but is prognostic, tells you what's going to happen to you. The challenge is that there are about, if we make the analogy, there's probably like 100,000 people who want to have an MRI scan, and amongst those, there are only 5 or 10 of you who've got PSC. And so you're the small number of people who need it, and there's already too many people needing MRIs of their spine, MRIs for cancer, MRIs for their heart. That essentially, there's an access issue. Okay, but ultimately, this is the sort of test that we want alongside a blood test, because you can put MRI scans in the back of a lorry, okay, and you can measure someone's liver stiffness, and you can get a whole of their liver, not just a little bit from the FibroScan, and it's not perfect, but it starts to give you the information you want about where am I on my journey. And what they do at the Mayo, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, is you can have the MRI at the same time as your MRCP. So you're already in the scanner, having your bile ducts looked at, so at the same time they measure your liver stiffness. Okay? And I think ultimately this will come to Ontario. It's just a journey. Are you
talking about MRIs or MREs?
MREs, but the point is MREs using the MRI scanner.
So is MRE available in Ontario?
Not for PSC. We're trying very hard. We've got some access to it for research, okay? But it all comes down to, if they start doing MREs for PSC, then they'll say, well, that's MRI time that they can't give to somebody else.
Can you describe what it is, like the physical thing?
Well, I mean, I actually haven't had an MRE, but I think they do put a device around your waist and it measures the liver stiffness. It's very similar to a FibroScan. It's doing the same technology.
It actually,
sits on it.
It's like a plastic thing and it vibrates.
Yeah. And it doesn't, when you're buying an MRI scanner, they cost a few $1 million. And the piece of equipment that they bought at UHM to do the MRE only cost $150,000. So actually, it's nothing at the outset. But the real issue is MRI time is very precious. It's funded by the province, and MRI scanners run 24 hours a day, okay? And they're worried that if they introduce new tests, that then the MRI time is, being used. Now, we don't worry about that because we're saying, look, our patients with PSC are there's not a lot of you, okay? But that's a test that we are trying to get because we think that helps you understand where you are. And in the future, what you'll find in a lot of clinical trials will include this test because they'll see whether it gets better. Again, on top of biopsies. Next slide. Okay, what about models? Doctors love models because you can write papers on them. Patients find them hard but can be useful. I'm not going to tell you which model to use. I'm just going to tell you that these models are not perfect, but they can help you. They actually help you the most to tell you that you're in the lowest risk group. Okay? They usually tell you what is obvious about when you're nearer the higher risk because you already know that. But they all use very similar pieces of information. I'll just rely on the last two. They look at your age, whether you're jaundiced, whether your protein's low, whether your enzymes are high, whether your platelets are dropping, and how long you've had PSC. And actually, we're starting to use them. And now what I do when I refer someone for transplant is not just tell them the MELD score, but I tell them what the model says for that patient for the next 5 and 10 years. Because we all recognize there isn't one test that's perfect for PSC. So we try and put together a story that says, look, this test is not showing everything about your disease, but a model that's specific to your disease is saying that this person is likely to run into problems in the next 5 years. Or alternatively, it might say, nothing's going to happen to this person for 10 or 15 years. This is great. That's what you want to know. Next slide. And you can go online. We put the UK PSC score online. The Amsterdam Oxford score is also online. the Mayo Presta score is also online. Okay, so it's something that patients can be empowered to understand themselves as part of their own journey. Next slide. Okay, it's probably better to do transplantation as in a discussion, but I'm going to give you the concepts around transplantation. The first concept is, let's be clear, it's a phenomenal operation, okay, that has changed everything for our patients. It's not perfect. We don't have enough donors. We have solutions for not having enough donors which have their own issues, okay? But it's a phenomenal move forward, okay? And what we do is try and work out when to assess, when you need one, and at the same time, you then actually come to the world of reality, okay? Allocation. And you can't change that, because allocation of a precious resource is done, provincially, nationally, internationally, okay? So there's a very clear difference between who needs one and who gets one, okay? And that's just how it is, okay? You can advocate, and that's something I think that the PSC community has surprisingly been quieter on than other communities with liver disease, okay? That they can advocate. And, the statistic I would use is, we know, and it's the same in the US, that if you have PSC, it's much more likely that you're going to get a live donor transplant than a deceased donor transplant. That must tell you something about the allocation system, okay? That the allocation system obviously doesn't suit you. Otherwise, our patients wouldn't be choosing to have a live donor, because that's not easy either. But our patients are overrepresented in the live donor population, which tells you that the model that we're using is obviously not good enough for you. Okay? That doesn't mean it's easy to change, because we want the same for all of our patients, but it's important to understand. So when you have an assessment, we look at your disease severity, whether you've had complications, malignancy, recurrent cholangitis, and we look at indication versus risk. Okay? Because ultimately you can't have an operation if your heart doesn't work, your lungs don't work, and your kidneys don't work. It's not the right thing to do. So you've got to balance it. You've got to be honest to your patient and say, yes, it's a good operation, or no, come on, you'll wake up with a new liver, but you'll still have the same heart, the same lung, the same liver, the same kidneys. There's no point in dressing something up that isn't how it is. Allocation works around disease severity. How sick are you? So the current system essentially works around your MELD score. And that also takes into account blood group. Some blood groups, there are less donors and more people need the livers, it can go the other way, okay? Now, for some scenarios, liver cancer, recurrent cholangitis, where they recognize that the MELD score doesn't go up, they can give you exception points. And then you accrue the same number of MELD points eventually. But it's not for every scenario, and not everyone with PSC necessarily gets exception points. This is a moving target, but this is again where we need more advocacy to say, at the least, not that we don't want other people not to have a transplant, we do, because they have their disease, it's not their fault. You're born with hepatitis B because that's where you come from, that's not your fault, it's still an impact on your life, okay, and you have liver cancer, so you also want a transplant. But you want to say, well, at least let's try and get the field a bit more as level as possible, okay? And then obviously the thing that really we do rely on, because we have phenomenal surgeons, is living-related transplantation, okay? And that's really a great success. It's a success particularly in Canada because you have a free healthcare system. It doesn't work in America because no one wants to pay for the donor. Okay? So someone always says, okay, well, you want me to pay for both patients, but only that one paid for the insurance. Okay? Fortunately, that's not the issue here. So it's very, very helpful for our patients, and that's the journey that many of you take. Next slide. And then lastly, we should always look at the future. Where are we going? What about new drugs? Okay, I put this slide up just to show you that there are lots of people trying to develop new drugs for bile duct diseases, and they're developing drugs in different classes. But there are, you can see here there is nearly 10 different drugs, and this is only 10 of probably 20 drugs that people are thinking about. So people are really trying very, very hard to get new therapies. Next slide. This is NOR-URSO. This is a trial that you can't take part in. This is a trial that's only happening in Europe because the company is European. It's a family, non-listed company, so they haven't come to America yet. They'll come eventually. Okay? They made URSO. They're now made a derivative of URSO. You take this new drug, your liver biochemistry gets better. I told you that's not bad, but I don't know what it means. Next slide. So the patients are taking part in a study that's going to last at least 4 years, but they'll look halfway through that study. So they're not going to wait the full 4 years to see whether there's enough to suggest that they can get the drug licensed. But they're looking at liver biopsy, and your liver biopsy mustn't get worse. Okay? So that's at the lower end of efficacy. Okay? It's not set it to as a very, very high challenge about improvement, but that's started, nearly recruited. They're after 330 patients. That's an enormous study. That's probably over 100 centres, where each centre probably ultimately only gets 2 to 3 patients recruited per centre. Okay, a big effort, but they're trying. No urso. Next trial. This is the drug that we now use for PBC, obeticholic acid, being trialed in PSC. So that's exciting. Okay, they demonstrate that you can make a new drug for one disease. They'll try it in another disease. Next slide. Okay, and this is what is the good thing about competition. So one company makes a drug called obeticholic acid, the other companies say, we can make a better one, okay? And suddenly you've got 3 or 4 companies, each trying to make their drug. You know, don't get it wrong, of course it's because they want to make profit, but that's to your benefit, because if they didn't want to make profit, there would be no drugs. So, you know, we need to move beyond that. But this drug also improves it, and this is the trial that Aaliyah's about to open at Toronto General with Gilead, which is a phase 3 trial of this drug, and they're looking for over 400 patients across the world. And again, they'll be looking at your liver biopsy not getting worse. So a pretty big undertaking. Next slide. I put this up, I think I showed it last time, but a lot of you will be now having your colitis treated by very expensive drugs like vedolizumab. Okay? Vedolizumab, anti-TNF. And the hope was that that would help your liver, and that hope hasn't translated into reality yet. Probably means we got the wrong drugs, but this was a study that we published of 100 patients from around the world, and it was perfectly safe to take vedolizumab, okay, but it didn't make your liver any better, okay? So safe but not effective. Next slide. And then we come on to where controversy is, okay? Vancomycin. Very, very interesting drug, an antibiotic, but it's not just an antibiotic, it's also an anti-inflammatory drug as well, okay? Been around a long time. People have been using vancomycin to treat ulcerative colitis in this city for 25 years, okay? They had patients who their ulcerative colitis didn't get better, they gave them vancomycin, and the ulcerative colitis did get better. Not randomized data, okay? Has been tried in PSC, and there are improvements in liver tests. Very interesting, because we want to know, could it be the bacteria in your bowel that are driving this disease? What we really don't know is it just getting better because it just made the colitis better? Did that actually make the liver better? And there's now going to be a study from the Mayo Clinic, 3 centres run by Keith Lindor. It's going to be the last thing he does in retirement, he tells me, where they're going to give vancomycin and they're going to watch the patients very, very carefully. Next slide. Because this is where a lot of therapies are headed, okay? You all have your colonoscopy and love it. Well, fecal transplants may be somewhere that we're going to head towards new therapies. I don't know whether it's the answer. They've done this for PSC. A third of patients who got, the way they wrote the paper, which was a bit cheeky, was out of 10 patients who got the fecal transplant, 3 patients, their blood tests got better by 50%. Now actually that means 7 patients, nothing happened, all their blood tests got worse. Okay? And so really what they showed is it was safe, and that we need to work to try to get it in a pill. And the reason I was in Germany was I was talking to a company, and we're about to do a study at Toronto General. We're going to send your poo off to Israel, okay, in a sealed box, you don't need to worry, okay, and they are going to grow every bacteria in your bowel, okay, to see whether or not they can make a cocktail of what's known as bacteriophages to kill those bugs. So rather than take antibiotics, they'll give natural, essentially non-viral therapy to kill bacteria. So people are trying very hard. Next slide. But again, we don't know the answer. And what we'd ask you is to bear with us, because we'll never know the answer if everything is uncontrolled. We realise your individual determination and your individual desire to be, at the cutting edge. At the same time, we may not answer questions if we don't do the studies correctly. and you may end up with murkiness forever, which actually it may or may not help us. Next slide. So proving it works is what we're all about. Really, if you look at the very bottom of the slide, the next drug, and there will be next drugs, I'm pretty confident in the next 10 years there will be therapies for patients with PSC. They'll start off as being a bit better, and slowly they'll get properly as effective as we want. Okay, but it'll be shown to work by improving maybe your blood tests and improving scarring. And the last slide, I think, and this is the slide, again, I probably showed it last year. This is what it's like, I think. I don't have PSC, I just look after lots of patients with PSC. But it's the things that concern me when I look after a patient with PSC. You know, we're trying to monitor you, we're trying to do research, we want you to have good quality care wherever you live, we don't really want there to be a difference. We're trying to understand the challenges that you face, and we're trying to understand a large part, for a long part, the fear, uncertainty, and social isolation that comes with a chronic disease with an uncertain course, and examples where patients do phenomenally well, but where we're all aware, both personally, professionally, you know, where the outcome is not what we wanted. Thank you.